Well, hello and welcome to the Church Office podcast. My name is Gavin Smith, and it's a joy today to welcome you to our administration, admin and ops podcast. We love talking about the work of ministry behind the scenes. And so thank you for listening in. And today's special guest is Lourens. You're from Stewardship, mate. We've got you on the podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a joy to be here today.
Well, before we get into our conversation, let me just say a couple of words about our sponsors, Church Suite. Thank you so much to Gavin and the team at Church Suite who have kindly gotten behind this podcast and really just encouraging us in the ministry and what we're doing. This is a brilliant piece of software. If you've not come across Church Suite before, then I know hundreds and hundreds of churches across the UK that are using it, not just as a church database, but it has so much more functionality. It will help you with your communication. It will help you with your organization. This is a tool that every church needs. This is a tool that administrators need. And so we want to signpost and point you to the Church Suite. Have you come across them before, Lourens, Church Suite? You must have done.
Yes, I use them myself. I've implemented Church Suite in a number of churches and charities. So
Yeah.
big fans of Church Suite. Yes.
Yeah, they do a fantastic thing. And what is lovely about them is they've got a lovely heart to strengthen and to work with the local church. They're passionate about the local church and they are passionate about the gospel. And that is the same for us. So working with like-minded people is just wonderful. So yeah, please check them out on their website. Lourens, let's chat more then. At the last episode, we were chatting about the pitfalls of church finances, and as governance gets harder and harder for churches, it's great to team up with Stewardship here and talk about some of these things that some of the challenges that we might be facing as churches in the area of governance. And Lourens, you're the managing director of Church and Charities Professional Services. Give us a little bit
Yes.
of background about yourself, like introduce yourself to kind of our listeners and what you
No
do.
problem. Yeah, that's a mouthful. But really, what it means, my job is coming alongside churches and Christian charities and helping them carry this burden, really, of governance, of leadership, of finance, of administration. Stewardship does a whole number of things. I'll explain a bit more about that. But really, the teams that I'm responsible for is coming alongside churches and Christian charities, like the unnamed brother, really, of 2 Corinthians 8. When
Mhm.
Paul sends the collection for the Christians in Jerusalem, and he sends it with Titus,
Yeah,
and he writes in 2 Corinthians 8, we're sending the brother who is known to you, who is trustworthy and known to the churches with Titus. And it's amazing how the extent to which Paul goes to make sure that everyone knows this money is handled in the right way, that everything's above board.
yeah,
And we don't know who this brother is, which is, I
yeah,
think, part of the point. He's not the named person in the story, and people speculate and people have different theories and so on. But I think part of the point is the person isn't named. And we're like that. We come
yeah,
alongside the churches and Christian charities, help them with finance, with their accounts, independent examinations. We've got a payroll bureau. We've got consultancy helpline, help advise churches and charities on finance and governance. And we've got external experts who speak into that, charity lawyers and employment lawyers and insurance specialists and buildings and VAT and all kinds of
yeah,
things. We help charities get registered. We do webinars for treasurers and trustees. The next one is actually in a couple of days. Do trustee training. We've got lots of resources on our website. So really, it's an effort to help churches and Christian charities, particularly, not just get by, but
yeah,
flourish and
yeah.
succeed in these areas of governance. So we've got about 500 churches that we do the accounts for.
Wow.
So exclusively churches and Christian charities. We pay about 3,800 people every month for about 880 churches and Christian charities again. So quite a sizable reach, and we just love to come alongside churches and that. Stewardship also uh, does other things. So we encourage and help support generous giving by Christians and others. So we've got, I think, over 30,000 people giving to us as a charity. and then they ask us to make grants to churches,
Fantastic.
charities, individuals, so missionaries, Bible college students,
Yeah.
and so on. We lend money to churches for building projects and
Yeah.
charities, and yeah, so a whole range of things.
Yeah.
But yeah, primarily I'm responsible for the professional services element of it.
Yeah, mate, it's a massive piece of work, isn't it? I mean, you guys are doing a fantastic job serving all sorts of different sized churches with all the different ranges of things that you're talking about there.
I
And
always tell people when I speak to new churches or charities or people who we don't serve at the moment yet, that it really is one of the privileges of my job to be able to speak to them, because I speak to churches and charities up and down the land all the time,
yeah,
from, like you say, very small to new church plant, or a church that's faithfully been ministering the gospel, but they are just over £25,000 in income, and
yeah,
they have 20 people, to very large multi-site
mm,
churches that are struggling, churches that are doing well, new ones, old ones, and it really is always encouraging, God's faithfulness over time, despite current challenges, or currently people serving wholeheartedly with joy. It really is one of the privileges of this
yeah.
job.
It's so true, isn't it? And I think some of the governance and the work that happens behind the scenes, whether
Mm.
you've got 50 people in a church or you've got 1,500 people, you still have to have knowledge in all these different areas. You still have to report in all these different ways.
Mhm.
And for churches that are smaller, this is a huge burden and often gets left with volunteers as well, isn't it? That who are, situations I can think of where you've got a church has a pastor,
Mm.
and then those trustees are all voluntary. You've got
Yeah,
some voluntary people behind the scenes that are trying to manage finances, manage buildings, complex issues over governance. Um, it is tough, isn't it? And if you're involved in that and you're hearing this today, then please be encouraged in the service to your church and also make the connection between what you're doing and our mission. You are helping the mission of the church. You are supporting those ministers who are in leadership to do what God's called them to
absolutely.
do. And be encouraged first of all from today's podcast.
Yeah.
Lawrence, what
Yeah.
are some of the trends? What are some of the big challenges you think that churches are coming to you for help? Does anything come to mind as you think of that?
Um, I, I think the concept of time, kind of looms large over all of this. I think we're all aware that life is busy. Everyone seems busy. When you ask someone, how are you doing? Very often the answer is, "Oh, I'm so busy,"
Yeah,
which can mean any number of things.
yeah, yeah,
And sometimes people think they're busy, but actually, they probably have more time if they were just a bit more deliberate about it. But the reality is, everyone is busy.
yeah.
And I think one of the things that we tend to see, as well, is some churches have been served for a long time
Hmm.
by faithful saints, um, in particularly in some of these behind the scenes roles, treasurers, administrators,
Yeah,
secretaries of, PCCs,
yeah,
or elder boards, or whatever the case may be. And they just don't have the energy. They don't have the ability anymore to kind of necessarily, or the desire to invest the time to keep up with all of the ever-changing demands, whether that's in payroll or accounts. So those people are stepping down, and I think we're seeing that
yeah,
as the trend. Uh, Younger people are time poor, people with day jobs that are,
yeah,
ever busier, people with families, and very often uh, the people who step up to take on roles, that like the ones that we're talking about, are people who then also end up doing 2 dozen other things at church too. So uh, we very often see the emails that came in at 1 a.m., 2 a.m. in the morning.
yeah, yeah,
Um, and my heart really goes out to those people. It's you know all of the people on my team are treasurers and trustees ourselves, Christians active in our own local churches, and we see those emails. I see those emails, and no, I've sent them myself.
Mm.
To stewardship or other independent examiners, or because when do you get to these things? Very often it is, when everybody's gone to bed, when it's 1 a.m. on a Saturday morning.
Yeah.
Um, and the requirements are just becoming more and more complex and more onerous for all charities, but particularly um, charities that don't have full-time staff.
Yeah.
Yeah, and many churches are reliant on volunteers. So I think those are big trends. Um, I think it's also clear that just the expectations
Mm.
in terms of governance, in terms of the standard of governance, is increasing. We know we live in a social media age too, where it's very easy for anybody with something to say, can get it out there, and it's
Yeah.
very hard to combat that. So in some sense, it feels like we all have to raise our game.
Yeah.
Again, 2 Corinthians 8 kind of language. Paul says to do not just what is right in the eyes of God, but also in the eyes of man.
Hmm.
And it's always striking to me that that was something he took seriously.
Yeah.
Um, and that doesn't mean that we're doing these things to impress people,
Hmm.
whether
Yeah.
that's regulators
Yeah.
or the media or just people in general. Of course, always we do these things because that is what God expects of us. That is God honoring to do these things well.
Yeah.
But there's a witness element to it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I get these emails from the Charity Commission. Anybody can sign up for them. For some reason, mine come through on a Saturday morning. I'm going to look into whether I can change that because my heart stops,
Yeah.
for a couple of seconds every time that email comes through because it lists all of the
Yeah.
investigations they're launching and
Yeah.
everything that's gone wrong and the scandals and so on. And
Yeah.
you don't want churches to be on that list.
Yeah. You don't.
We want people to say, listen, yes, some charities are dodgy, but we don't have any concerns about churches.
Yeah.
They are the standard. They are the gold standard. They excel. They do this well. They are good
Yeah.
stewards of the money of that people have given to them, that they get from gift aid or whatever source. Uh, we all want to be like them, and I think that's an element of our Christian witness as churches and Christian organizations.
Yeah, totally agree, isn't it? That there's an excellence that we want that
Yeah.
reflects something of God's character, doesn't it? That
Mhm.
as we oversee and yeah, we want to reflect something of who he is and to do it
Yeah.
well, and for people to know that there's confidence
Mhm.
in the leadership team that these matters are being handled well behind the
Yeah.
scenes, and
Absolutely. Yeah.
it is. And I've met lots of churches in the last 6 months who have found it more increasingly difficult to find
Mhm.
trustees, and I
Mhm.
know some of the changes with the CIOs mean that some of the liability, potential liability, is being limited because of the
Yeah.
introduction of that, and a need to kind of see new trustees come forward. Are you noticing that as well? People who've got old trustees who are finding it hard to recruit.
Absolutely. I think it again, it links in somewhat to what I said before in terms of time, people being very cautious. And there's been a trend also since COVID, where lots of people resigned from positions, lots of organizations, again, not just Christian
Yeah,
charities and churches, but charities more widely, um, have struggled to recruit volunteers for all kinds of roles since COVID. People have just, I think, at that point took a step back and said,
yeah,
I don't have to do all of these things. I don't have to run myself ragged. I am going to be very discerning. And perhaps the pendulum swung too far for some
hmm
people,
hmm
maybe a good
yeah,
corrective for some people.
yeah,
And I think that's healthy, not to overcommit yourself. But the pendulum has swung perhaps too far the other way. So that's definitely an issue, people not wanting to commit. But rightly, particularly in organizations that are trusts, registered as trusts, as charities, where you have unlimited liability,
Mhm.
where the trustees, and people don't always realize this, but
Mhm.
a trust doesn't exist as its own legal entity. It
Mhm.
has no kind of legal existence.
Mhm.
The trust only exists in the trustees.
Mhm.
So if you're a trust and you own property,
Mhm.
the trustees own the property. And
Yeah.
every time the trustees change, you have to go and update at the land registry.
Yeah.
And you get it's very, very common actually, particularly with some older churches and things, that actually the property is owned at the land registry at least by people who don't live it, who aren't alive anymore.
Yeah.
None of
Yeah.
the trustees are alive anymore.
Yeah.
And that's a whole mess to sort out then,
Yeah.
or employing staff. So we're definitely seeing that we help a fair few churches and charities convert to CIOs every year
Mhm.
from trusts because of those reasons.
Yeah.
Um, and I think you see that also because in the past, say the FIEC, for example, had a property trust board that held a lot of properties in trust on behalf of trusts
Yeah.
that were part of the FIEC. But that is being wound down, so people are converting to CIOs in advance of that.
Mhm.
But interestingly, another thing that has uh, developed over the last year or two is from the other side, because you have trusts, you have CIOs, and you have charitable companies
Mhm.
as basically your options to
Yeah.
register a charity. And to avoid those issues that we talked about just now with trusts, many charities registered as charitable companies, particularly
Yeah.
before CIOs were
In existence.
an
Yeah.
option.
So,
So those were your two options. And that was fine, but the company exists as a legal entity and you could own property in the company,
mhm.
don't have those issues, employ staff, limited liability for the trustees. But you had the slight drawback that you had to deal with company's house admin as well. And if your accounts had income of less than £250,000, then you didn't have the option of doing simpler receipts and payments
Yeah.
accounts. So
Yeah.
yeah, but people got around that, and if you had a qualified accountant or something like that as a treasurer, then it probably wasn't too much of an effort, and
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
worked around that. CIOs then came in, but the problem with companies is you have literally hundreds and thousands of Mickey Mouses and Donald Ducks and so on being registered as company directors.
Yeah.
And you have
Mhm.
companies being set up with no checks. So there's money laundering going on, and the government is trying
Yeah.
to clean that up. Charitable companies, unfortunately, are swept up with that.
Yeah.
So there's going to be a whole lot of extra admin. Directors or trustees are going to have to be ID checked, like when
Yeah.
you open in your bank account. You will have to file accounts digitally with Companies House. So at the moment, if you are a charitable company, you post in your accounts to Cardiff, to Companies House, and they
Yeah.
scan them in. Won't be able to do that anymore. So unless you or your accountants or your independent examiner who prepares the accounts, for example, has software that you can file those accounts with,
Mhm.
you're stuck.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so lots of things happening there, and we're seeing quite an uptick of charitable companies wanting to convert to CIOs as
Yeah.
well. Um,
Yeah, and it was my understanding that a CIO could be registered with the land registry to reduce the number of changes that need to be made if a
yeah.
change of trustee and so there's some savings as well, isn't there? Of
Oh yeah,
in terms of that.
absolutely. Yeah. So a CIO exists in its own
Mm,
right as a
yeah,
legal entity. So similar to a company in that regard, although you don't have all of the baggage of being a company and
yeah,
complying with company's house regulation, which, like I've said, is just shooting up massively at the moment. It's really becoming very onerous. And there's a relatively simple process to convert. It's you stay the same legal entity. If you convert from a company to a CIO, you
hmm
keep your same charity number. You can keep your same bank account details usually. So it's definitely something to consider
yeah,
for charitable companies.
yeah,
Interestingly, I mean, you'd think that I mean CIOs have been around for 15 odd years or something like that. And initially, obviously, it was new, slightly untested. People weren't quite sure.
mm,
But 95% 95% of charities now are registered as CIOs. It's well tried and tested,
Yeah.
well trodden, and sorted out. And still, we sometimes see new charities registered in the last 3, 4 years, registered as charitable companies. A
Mhm.
church that's set up as a charitable company, their income is something like 70, 80,000 pounds. So not huge, no
Yeah.
reason for them to be a charitable company, but they have to do the complex full accruals accounts, the
Yeah.
charity SOP
Yeah.
compliance, pages and pages of notes,
Mhm.
all of that, when actually they could be a CIO and they could do much simpler receipts and payments accounts. And then I asked them, why did you go down the route of setting up a company? And almost always they were told by an accountant or a lawyer, no one understands CIOs or something, or they knew, or no one knows about them.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and it's very clear that it's accountants or lawyers who don't really understand or know charities.
Mhm.
So I think it's important, it's always important to get good advice, and
Yeah.
there are good advisors out there. And but make sure it's people who specialize in this area, because even qualified chartered accountants, become treasurers of their churches or charities,
Mhm.
struggle when they come to charity accounts. It is very different, and it's much more complicated than
Yeah,
your
it is.
normal kind of limited company set of
Yeah.
accounts or something. I mean, my entry into this world was years ago now, when I started going to a church plant,
Yeah.
and just as I started going there, been there for a couple of weeks, basically because of things that have been building up over time, it all erupted,
Mm.
and basically, the church plant almost collapsed, and lots of reasons, as always with these things. But one of the reasons was that the finances and governance and so on wasn't focused on to the extent that it should have been. It's never the main thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
The gospel, people being saved, the people being brought into the kingdom, that is always the main thing.
Yeah.
But as with many churches, many church plants, very entrepreneurial growth, focus on relationships and preaching and
Yeah.
small groups, and because of things being neglected in the governance and finance space, particularly,
Yeah.
that had built up. But yeah, I'm a qualified chartered accountant. Worked in the city, big four accounting firm, investment banks, and so on. And I had a pastor hand me a cardboard box full of papers and receipts, and a panic-stricken look on his face, and just one word, help.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I took it, and I had to jump into the deep end, and learn about charity finance and governance and things. But that was part of the Lord's way, I guess, of
Yeah.
preparing me for this
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 role.
current
Yeah.
role. Yeah,
Yeah. I love that. It's
yeah,
great. And we were chatting earlier
mm,
and I love, church plants and what an opportunity to work with a church plant
yeah,
before they start, isn't it? And to
mm,
get some of these structures in place,
absolutely.
it's an absolute joy. And I guess part of the challenge is getting the leader on board to say, actually, we really need to prioritize this. We need you involved in this process. It's not just
Yeah,
the two different kind of elements of the work. Um, and we found, yeah, we've been trying to, I guess, change that culture a little bit where leaders are coming out of seminary
mm,
having very little understanding about this behind the scenes stuff. And it can be
absolutely.
awfully frustrating sometimes, I think, that
Mm.
they get an hour on safeguarding, they get an hour on finances, and those are optional seminars. It's so frustrating.
If
Um,
even that,
yeah,
it's
sometimes they don't even turn up
very,
to
very
those.
minimal. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on pastors who might be listening to this to say, please take an interest in this area?
Oh, so many thoughts. I after I worked in the city, like I said, God was calling me progressively into this world. So as a treasurer and a trustee and an elder of the church, eventually of that church plant. And by God's grace, we righted the ship, and the church flourished for many years. But eventually, uh, I got called really out of that world, of the day job.
Mm.
Resigned, went to seminary. So I
Hmm.
went to Oak Hill Theological College, did four
Yeah.
years there eventually, BA and then a master's. Um, and interestingly, while I was there, and long before stewardship was, even on the horizon as an option or something, or that this was part of the plan, it wasn't.
Mm.
Uh, a team from stewardship came and did basically a day-long session
Right.
for us there, which is essentially the trustee training that we now do,
Yeah.
but tailored for that audience. And it was great, and it was great from the foresight of the principal at that
Yeah.
time at Oak Hill, Johnny Jukes and others, and the team from stewardship to recognize, well, all of these people are probably
Yeah.
going to be trustees,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
By virtue of being there and the roles that you're going into, you're going to be a trustee. That is
Yeah.
part of the role in this of being a pastor, being a minister, being a youth worker, even, that is part of the game. And it's so important to equip people for that because this is also ministry.
Yes.
Uh, and even if you're not the person directly responsible for the finances, all trustees have collective responsibility for the
Yeah.
finances of the charity.
Yeah.
People don't realize that. Oh, this is for the treasurer, and we don't ask questions because we don't want to know the answers, not
Yeah. Yeah.
because
Yeah.
we think there's something wrong, but if we know the answers, if we ask too much, then we have some sort of responsibility. But somehow there's this sense if we just leave it all to the treasurer and don't ask and don't just trust them, then we avoid responsibility. Not true.
Mm.
Um, I think the key thing is for ministers, for pastors, really to see that this is an absolutely crucial part of ministry.
Yeah.
Um, it is their responsibility, just as Paul, and again, kind of going back to 2 Corinthians 8,
Yeah.
he is the apostle Paul. Besides, after Jesus, probably the most influential and most important person who's
Mm.
ever lived. I
Mm.
mean, the effect of Paul's missionary journeys, of what he
Yeah.
did, these writings, how it's influenced and shaped the world. Even, non-Christians
Yeah.
acknowledge that.
Yeah.
Uh, he is concerned with things being done right with this collection being taken to
Mm.
Jerusalem. He personally takes an interest to make sure that the right people are in the right roles.
Mm.
And I think that is part of the role
Yeah.
of,
Yeah.
of, of a pastor, of a minister. If you look at something like, uh, you know, uh, 1 Corinthians 12, when Paul talks about the spiritual gifts,
Hmm. Hmm.
uh, in
Yeah.
the ESV, there's specifically the spiritual gift of administration.
Yeah.
You can translate guidance, a number of things. It comes from the action of the rudder of a ship,
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
guiding. And so important what is done in the administration of a
Yeah.
church in terms of how it functions, the health of it.
Yeah.
You can do as much work as you want to have that vine grow.
Hmm.
You
Yeah.
can water it, you can give it food, you can put it in the sun, you can
Yeah.
do all kinds of things. But if that vine grows and the trellis doesn't grow or is strengthened to support it, the vine collapses eventually.
Yeah.
So, spiritual gift of administration, when you have someone like that in your church, whether that's on staff or a volunteer, that is a blessing.
Huge.
And
Yeah.
that is a huge blessing.
Yeah.
And then you kind of think of, Ephesians 4, what is the role of the gifts that God has given to the church in the form of the
Yeah.
pastors and the elders? It is to equip the saints for ministry,
Yeah. Yeah.
and encourage and fan the flames, and give them the biblical input, the training, the teaching, the encouragement to flourish in those areas where God has gifted them.
Yeah.
And I think that is absolutely a key part of a pastor, of a minister's role in a church, is to encourage those people who have those gifts. It doesn't mean you have to be the expert on,
Yes.
the charity soap or something like that. Please, no. If
Yeah.
you've got
Yeah.
a pastor
Yeah.
who knows about those things and maybe was an accountant before, clearly they'll know something.
Yeah.
But really encouraging, supporting, equipping those saints who have these gifts for ministry, and
Yeah.
making sure those structures are there. How often do we celebrate, people with those gifts and in
Yeah.
those roles in
Yeah. Yeah.
church?
Yeah.
Um, I think it's probably more common to thank the Sunday school teachers or something like that,
Yeah.
and they
Yeah.
should be thanked.
Yeah.
Um, the people who do the outreach ministries, the people who run the soup kitchen or the food bank or the free English classes or whatever. Um, and we should celebrate and thank
Yeah.
these people and encourage them publicly. But we should also encourage and celebrate the people who look after the finances, the people who make
Yeah.
sure the admin gets done. The the church suite database is kept up to date, and
Yeah.
the people who count the offering and make sure that gets paid into the bank account every
Yeah.
every every week, and the people who make sure the gift aid is claimed. Uh, it's so crucial as a pastor to play that role, and I think
I
it's the
think, yeah,
unseen things. Yeah.
you are spot on, isn't it? And I think if you're a pastor listening to this, if you can value the gifts and value that work, it hugely blesses those. It really does lift the burden for those who are carrying those responsibilities in the church. And you're absolutely right. And we've talked about it on the podcast before
Mm.
about the gift of administration. And I think one of the things I find, Lawrence, that leaders will often say to me is,
Mm.
I don't know how to identify it in individuals. I don't know how, I don't know how to test it and to find out if that gift is present. And I'd be interested in your perspective on that.
Mm. So one way to come at that question is something else that we often see is, I speak to pastors, to ministers, to retiring or desiring to be retired treasurers,
Yeah,
and they tell me there's just no one who can do this. I don't have anybody who has the gifts or the skills or the time, or the expertise or experience to take on these roles. And that often comes from either the kind of expectation that there'd be someone who can do all aspects of a role,
yeah, yeah.
or where you've got someone who's been in post for a long time, and you've just been blessed with someone who has been able to take on the role of treasurer and do everything that's involved there,
Mhm.
um, from you know taking care of the offering on a Sunday or something through to the annual accounts and the independent examination and audit and gift aid and all kinds of things. The reality is, again, people don't necessarily have the time, and people don't necessarily have that full breadth of skills and experience,
Yeah,
whether that's being a treasurer or being an administrator or something. And that's a big mistake we can make, is needing to see all of those gifts and skills, and all of that experience in one person, and that puts people off from
Mhm.
stepping forward
Yeah,
to take on these roles. People don't feel equipped, or we think, again, we've got to see all of that in one person. It has to sit in one role.
yeah,
Uh, and that doesn't have to be the case. I think one of the most effective ways often of drawing someone in who might not be front and center and doing all kinds of things is to give them something small to take responsibility for.
yeah,
We have a briefing paper on our website that goes by the title of something like "Finance is better as a team sport,"
yeah.
and I think that is so true.
I totally
Uh,
agree. Yeah,
putting these burdens on one person, particularly when they're volunteers, is often counterproductive, because people feel crushed, and when you're trying to recruit, when you're trying to find someone, you just don't get takers.
mm,
But it can actually, positively very often be a huge encouragement, and you see people flourish who otherwise don't feel like there's something for them to do.
mm,
They're not the front and center people. They're not the teachers and the worship leaders and the youth group leaders, or but they can do this little bit and
yeah,
feel like they've, with the time, they have available, with the
Yeah.
gifts they have, they making a contribution. They're using their gifts and skills, and I think that is often, as a pastor, as a church leader, you have a view of all of the different people in the congregation
Hmm.
that very few other people have.
Yeah.
You speak to
Yeah.
people, people speak to you, you have conversations with people that no one else has. And it's a tapestry
Mhm.
that gets woven of the congregation.
Mm.
And I think pastors are in a unique position to see, what people talk about and hear what they talk about and
Yeah.
see what they're good at, and uh, also use these tasks, these functions of administration, of governance, and so on in the church, perhaps to pastorally encourage people,
Yeah.
people who, like I say, otherwise don't necessarily feel like they've got something to contribute, and they,
Yeah.
they they flourish. So I think there are a number of different ways of doing that.
Yeah.
Um,
That's
in
helpful because you're
yeah,
right. The pastors do have a perspective. They do
mm,
meet the people when they come on your new members course. They
mm,
do fill out an application form that you're hoping to capture
yeah,
some ideas of their passion, what they're working, what their
mm,
experience is, and matching people to roles is often a challenge for pastors in terms of just the time element, I think. But one of the churches I saw in Manchester that just had a different kind of approach to this, and it might be worth mentioning on the podcast is they
mm,
had these kind of service coordinators, sort of
mm,
deacons, who had the same level as somebody who was a treasurer, but they recognized that actually getting people into roles, supporting them and encouraging them to take on some of these finance team roles or the behind the scenes ministries, they had the time and the dedication and the scope to just serve people in that way, come
mm,
alongside people, get to know them, help deploy them, support them. And I just thought it's a change of mindset that needs to come with leaders that go, actually, how can we do this? We believe in every member ministry,
mm.
but what are some of the structures that go behind that make that actually possible? Um, and I thought it was a really, really good idea, and well done to that church in
Mm.
Manchester who've, sort of implemented it.
Absolutely. And there's no one size fits all answer there, is there?
No.
In a small church, it'll look very different to a large church that's
Yeah.
got staff and structures, and how you encourage people in their ministry, in these areas when you've got a staff who take care of the day to day and the administration and things, and a lot of the kind of practicalities of church. It looks very different to a small
Yeah.
church. And it's having that wisdom and that discernment about when transitions need to happen in structures as well. And I know you've spoken to Ray Evans about this kind of
Yeah.
a thing. Very often, churches get stuck at a point.
Yeah.
We've done it this way,
Yeah.
and that kind of transition from almost a large small church to a small large church
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
is almost one of the most difficult transitions. That
It is.
awkward size, I
Yeah.
think, in
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
sense that Ray
Yeah.
talked about on the podcast. So things have to develop, and
Yeah.
you saw that with Moses, when he led the Israelites into the wilderness, and you've got Jethro coming, and he
Yeah.
says, like, are what are you doing?
Yeah.
This isn't sustainable for you.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
need these leaders over thousands and hundreds and tens, and
Yeah.
all of these things. And that becomes part of the role. Then how do
Yeah.
you
That's
equip people as a pastor to equip other people?
yeah.
You don't have to
Yeah.
do all of that directly, but
And I
seeing.
think, yeah, that Exodus 18 is a great example of that, isn't it? The deploy there's some kind of evaluation, isn't there, of leaders that can oversee 10 and those who oversee 1,000, and there's some kind of analysis of their gifting and deployment. And I love, as you read the end of that chapter, it says that all the people went to that place in peace.
Mm,
And you think that's what we want our church to experience behind the scenes, isn't it? Church is a place of order, of peace, where people can find where they fit, where they can use their gifts, that
mm,
they're flourishing in those gifts. And yeah, that's a big part of this kind of behind the scenes ministry, isn't it? The thinking behind it.
absolutely. A bit interesting, this kind of following on from there. There's a there's an at the other end of the spectrum, there's another extreme, though. If you kind of say, well, in some churches there's no structure, this isn't taken seriously. So you can see Mahershala al-Hashbaz in the back there on the chair. uh, Hurry to the plunder, which he does when the food comes out. One of Isaiah's children named after. Um, but in some churches, these things aren't focused on. There's no structure. There's no
Yeah,
focus. Um, Equally, the other end of the spectrum can be where these things take over.
yeah,
And you do see that too. You do see
yeah,
where the main things
yeah,
are not the main things anymore. And that's not healthy either.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
We have to keep the main things the main things. And I remember being at a conference that a church was hosting once, and clearly they are on it. They have people organizing things with military precision, and there were interns,
yeah,
galore, running up and down and sorting this out. And I remember just sitting there thinking, guys, just relax,
yeah,
be more Mary. You're making me tired
yeah.
and anxious. Yeah, you're awakening the Martha in me, feeling anxious. Um, and yeah, that can also happen when we become so focused on structure and organization
Yeah,
that the trellis must support the vine.
yeah,
And I think that is still
yeah.
important to remember.
Yeah, and it's a tension, isn't it, that has to be managed. It's
Mm,
something that has to be, you know, reviewed, and it's
yeah.
easy, isn't it, for one to become more important, well, the administrative stuff, the finance, the governance to become more important than the gospel message. And
Yeah.
we're there to facilitate staff, isn't it, to enable the mission to happen, and
Mhm.
it is an enabling role, and we do need to kind of remind ourselves of that, I think.
And yet, it's also, again, it's a constant corrective, isn't it? There's a,
Yeah,
where are we focusing on? Where's our energy going? Are we doing too little? Are we doing too much? We don't just want to hit the minimum requirements. We want to excel and flourish and
yeah,
be good in these areas. But where are we spending our time? Where are we spending our energy?
yeah,
What do we have to do? What's required legally? What's
yeah,
not?
yeah,
But you sometimes have conversations with churches, as I'm sure you have as well, where they are not registered as charities,
hmm hmm
for example,
yeah,
because the church isn't a secular institution. The authorities, the government has nothing to say about us as a church. So well, the law says if
yeah,
you are an organization with exclusively charitable purposes and you exist for the public benefit,
yeah,
then you have to register as a charity, at
yeah,
the very least when your income is over £5,000.
yeah,
Uh, so then you're smack bang into the Romans 13, fifth
yeah,
commandment kind of territory as well. There's an element in which God has in this country called us to be obedient to the authorities he has placed over us for our good,
yeah,
in his wisdom.
yeah,
This is how God has chosen to have the church function in the United Kingdom.
yeah,
And we kind of lose sight of that maybe slightly sometimes and think, oh, this is something extra. This is something
yeah,
we've got to do. We've got a box we've got to tick. No, in God's wisdom, he has ordained it that in this country it works this way.
mm,
And I think that's also important for us to remind ourselves of.
mm,
And let's
yeah.
do this well too.
Yeah. Gift aid is not evil.
No, gift aid is not evil. No, no. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. But if Caesar doesn't want that 25%, make
He
sure
wants
you
to
get
give it
it
back
back.
to you.
Yes, yes. Use it for the ministry, for the growth of the kingdom.
Yeah,
Don't forgo that because somehow people think the charity commission is going to instruct churches what to preach if you get gift aid or something like that. There's none of that, and we
yeah,
have freedom of religion, and advancing the Christian faith is well established as a charitable purpose in law in this country.
Yeah.
Nothing is changing there anytime
Yeah,
soon. So,
absolutely right.
yeah.
Absolutely right. I want to just go back to one point that you made earlier
Mm,
about team approach
mm,
and that's so important. I was just thinking about that as particularly in the area of finances
mm,
and what you were saying about the treasurer and the multi-skill, the multi-knowledge that you need right across what serves churches in finances. One of the things that we chatted about before on another podcast is actually introducing some software
mm,
like something like Expense Plus.
mhm.
We found churches that have drawn a younger age who love a bit of software, that love a little bit of tech, that
Yeah.
can, create these kind of multi-levels and people can log in and upload their
Mm,
expenses and upload different things. They can monitor their budgets. You start to bring a little bit of life possibly into
yeah.
what is just the boring old spreadsheets that they might interpret. And we've seen lots of churches that have gone to a software and gone, well, this has really helped build a team around the treasure. And I think you're nodding there, you're probably thinking the same.
Absolutely. Yes, and it enables you to do so many things when you take that step.
Yeah,
Um, Now, in some cases, again, if you're very small, maybe it's overkill or something to do. You don't have to force the church into that kind of a thing. But where churches have taken that step, even smaller ones,
yeah,
it, like you say, it enables collaboration in a
yeah,
way that a static spreadsheet, doesn't. So
mhm,
by definition, almost,
yeah,
you're limited to one person really updating it or something. Whereas software, different people can input. And in something like Expense Plus, that we know
yeah,
well at Stewardship, we work well with them to enables people to own budgets for their areas or something
yeah,
like that. So you
yeah,
can, the youth ministry, the refreshments, the welcome team, the soup kitchen, you can allocate budgets to people. They can own that. They can see the amounts. They can see
yeah,
the figures. They can
yeah,
approve expenses. It it streamlines things to no end. And the other thing it does, it gives you up to date information,
yeah,
and the
absolutely right.
relevant decision makers can get up to date information, so you can see how things are going, as opposed to everybody sitting there and mm, waiting for a treasurer to give an update,
Yeah,
which may or may not have the information they need or they want. People, or if you're in a big meeting like that, there might be lots of other aspects to the church finances that aren't as relevant as
yeah,
the bit that you need to know as someone who
yeah,
runs a specific ministry.
yeah,
So absolutely, and it can be transformational. The other thing that software does also is actually it makes a lot of those processes that seem very onerous, like claiming
yeah,
gift aid,
yeah,
which can become very onerous, particularly if you don't do it regularly. You have to do it manually,
yeah,
and you sometimes see it building up, not just for months, but
mm,
for years in some churches, because
yeah,
once if you're not on top of it, it can easily grow and it
yes,
becomes this big mental block. I couldn't possibly, where do we even start?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um, Whereas if you've got software like Expense Plus or Liberty or other software
yeah,
that's designed for churches particularly and charities, and as that functionality built in,
yeah,
um, doing the books, doing the bookkeeping, doing the accounts, doing the gift aid, doing payroll, even those things become a lot easier, and it becomes just almost automated
yes,
and
yeah,
part of the
yeah.
just built in day to day.
Yeah. I think that's right. And if you're involved in a church and we talked right at the start of this podcast about
Mm,
time being a challenge and capacity and I think one of the things that we've done here at our church is just outsourced our payroll.
mm,
And it's not necessarily a complicated job that I can't do it. It's not but it saves me probably 2 hours a month
yeah,
which we're paying a set amount of money for. It's in the budget, and those 2 hours that I have can be spent in a different way that's more
absolutely.
focused into mission or more focused into staff and caring for staff than doing that. And churches, think about some of your capacity and think about
Mm,
some of the ways that actually you could draw in other services like stewardship
yeah.
to take care of that one aspect of finances. And it makes
Yeah,
sense, doesn't it?
absolutely. And that is so true. We mentioned earlier about the kind of 1 a.m. emails, um, and it's very often uh, completely unseen. All of that, that the
Yeah,
time and the effort that goes into whether it's accounts or payroll, or just kind of lots of general admin,
yeah,
very often, but particularly those two when you've got deadlines and they have to be met, particularly kind of the relentless rhythm of the payroll
yeah,
schedule every month. And it's unseen, so lots of people don't necessarily realize that's going on. Um, and we talked earlier about how pastors can support people in these roles. I think pastors, trustees, elders, I would encourage them to ask the people
yeah,
serving in these roles, how much time does it take?
yeah,
Do you have the capacity?
yeah,
Do we need to get you help? When are you doing these things? Are
yes,
you fitting them in between all kinds of other things? Are you doing it 1 a.m., 2 a.m. in the morning?
mm, mm,
Um, because the other conversation that you often have, particularly when people are sometimes forced to
yeah,
look for some external help, whether that's for their accounts or payroll or something, is um, but we get it done for free at the moment.
yeah,
The treasurer does this free,
yeah,
so this is quite expensive.
yeah,
And I just want to shout down the phone when I have those conversations. But it's not free. Someone is paying.
yeah,
Your
yeah,
treasurer is paying with that lack of sleep. Your treasurer is paying with the stress
yeah,
the day before she has to do
yeah,
the payroll. And
yeah.
I
The
know of
family are
cases like
paying,
that.
haven't they?
The
Yeah,
family is
yeah,
paying with the lack of being present.
yeah,
And I know of cases, not hypothetical, actual cases where uh, treasurers don't sleep the night before they've got to do the payroll that month
yeah, yeah,
because of it's not what they do.
yeah,
And they try and do it with HMRC's free online tools,
yeah,
but which, I guess work, in simple cases doesn't necessarily isn't as great with more complex stuff. But just generally, this isn't what they do. They don't know
yeah,
what they don't know.
yeah,
So the fear of getting something wrong
yeah,
is immense. And
yeah,
then you've got the revenue, being, on them if something goes wrong. But there's also it's incredible how we, unfortunately, in the church put up with practices that those of us who work for other organizations, and very often treasurers who might
mm,
work for
mm, yeah,
private sector organizations, would never put up with those things in their own
yeah, yeah,
workplace.
yeah,
How many pastors and church staff members and so on get paid incorrectly or not on time?
yeah,
People get paid late sometimes because the treasurer went on holiday
yeah,
and forgot to set up the payments before he left.
yeah,
Yeah, and
yeah,
we would never put up with those things in the private sector.
yeah,
But somehow it's if not accepted, then to some extent tolerated, with an
yeah,
apology or
yeah,
something like that, perhaps in the
yeah,
church. And I think it's 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 absolutely not loving
yeah,
towards the people in those
yeah,
roles to expect
yeah,
them to do these things when they don't have the time and they don't have the
yeah,
capacity. So we talked about the kind of shift, that is happening perhaps in churches with recognizing, the importance of some of these things, putting the right support in place. I think a shift that needs to happen in more churches still is the thought that paying for someone to take care of these things in which they are experts and we are not
mm,
is freeing and liberating.
yes,
And it's not selling out. It's not wrong. It's not wasting money
yeah,
um, that could be used for other purposes or
yeah,
could be used for ministry or something. This
yeah,
is freeing people up for ministry by getting these things done well and right.
yeah,
And it's loving towards the people getting paid in those cases, and making sure that's done right and well,
yeah,
and
yeah,
there aren't issues. And when churches don't issue pay slips and kind of give people a series of pay slips at the end of the year for the whole year. I mean, that's illegal.
yeah.
It's also not great. Um, so I would encourage churches
Yeah,
again, think about what what do we need in terms of help and support. And if
yeah,
we don't have the people internally who can do this and have the who can serve joyfully,
yes,
not under compulsion, but with joy,
yeah,
then look at whether the loving thing to do would be to bring in outside help to take
yeah,
care of some of those
yeah.
things.
Yeah, I think that's right. You kind of almost hear that kind of permission to do
Mm,
that, to explore that. And if you haven't got the gifting in your church and it's gonna, get some quotes, get some outside help that can serve you. Because like you say, if we can release the pressure and the
mm,
stress and to make that a lot easier, ministry will flourish because of that. And it's got me thinking, Lawrence, just about kind of in the church, we're very good, I think, at training elders. I think
mm,
we're very good at sort of training our youth workers and
mhm,
evangelists, and we've put money and time into this. There's conferences, there's thinking that goes into that. But how are we training the next generation of trustees? How
mhm.
are we training the next generation of people who can serve and work behind the scenes? And and
Yeah.
I, and I certainly, as a church manager, feel that challenge is who can I bring on the journey with
Mm,
me? Who can I help? If I'm putting on an event, who can sit alongside me and help me to do this
mm,
that covers all the different aspects of finances, of
mm,
operations, of evaluation and review, and thinking of those things, and thinking about our insurance and all those questions that we ask before we do something. How do we bring people in? And I think sometimes I would love to see people who have been trained up as a trustee
mm,
being able to go and sit and see a meeting, go and learn and observe in a meeting. And I don't know many churches that are thinking that way and
yeah.
sort of putting that stuff together.
No, I th you're absolutely right. I think very often it's kind of assumed, oh, people will just kind of pick these things up.
Yeah,
Um, and that's not fair on those people that you're expecting to take on that responsibility. It's not healthy for the organization, for the church, for the group of people involved. And yeah, yeah, absolutely. We invest in training for all kinds of other roles. Um, there is trustee training available.
yeah,
Um, Stewardship does trustee training on a slight pause at the moment, but will be coming back in the not too distant future. There's also, plunder from the Egyptians. There are organizations like the Institute of Chartered Accountants, England and Wales, has free trustee training, and
yeah,
some of this is just the basics of uh, what being a trustee is, what's
yeah,
applicable to any trustee in any role.
yeah,
Um, I think that's another way of loving and blessing those people in those roles and equipping
yeah,
them for
yeah,
for what we've called them
yeah,
to do. If you've got a treasurer or a bookkeeper or something like that, send them on a bookkeeping course.
yeah,
There are organizations that do that. ACAT is Church Accountants and Treasurers
yeah.
Association. Um,
Very good.
they've
Yeah.
got very good people. They've got courses as well, or even a professional course like the Association of Accounting Technicians (AAT). Kind of
Mhm,
an entry
mhm.
level bookkeeping course or something like that. Um, many people, as we've said before, who might feel, oh, I don't know enough to do this,
Yeah,
um, would be willing if they've got the opportunity to be equipped in a professional way in that kind of a sense. Uh, Look for resources, speak to people like you've said, people who've done the same thing, people who've been through the same
mhm,
thing, people who've been on that journey. Um, Look to organizations like Stewardship, like UCAN, like ACAT, like other denominational and network bodies. Um, don't feel like you have to reinvent the wheel. It's probably
yeah,
likely that someone has done it before and this has something they would be more than willing to share, even if it's just another local church.
yeah. I totally agree. And that's so helpful to sit and chat with you about these things. And
Mm.
it's great to learn a little bit more about what stewardship are doing and working in the background. Is there anything that you've got currently that you think might be worth mentioning on the podcast for people to connect with stewardship over?
So we just love coming alongside churches and charities in these ways. So, like I said, we're doing quite a bit in terms of charities converting and so on at the moment. So if you are a trust, you want to become a CIO or a company, do get in touch. We work with great people at Anthony Collins
Yeah.
solicitors in doing that. And again, one of those things where if you try and do it yourself, you may well be able to. You may find it's more difficult than
Mm.
you think. Um, Accounts, like I say, lots of developments there, particularly for charitable companies, but also others. Uh, we're just grateful to be able to come alongside and serve um, churches and Christian charities in these ways. I think something else to mention. Um, some of the listeners who may have partner accounts with Stewardship, so where we make grants to those charities,
Yeah.
would have seen lots of communication recently. We've done quite a bit of work in upgrading those accounts, the public profiles of those online, so you know people
Great.
can do quite a lot more there in terms of telling their story
Yeah.
as a church or a charity with lots of rich benefits, videos, and all kinds of things that you can put on there, really to connect with donors and for people to be able to see. And we've seen that in our research report that came out earlier this year on generosity. People want to feel that sense of connection.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
so I think I would encourage people, if you do have a stewardship partner account, have a look at that, see what you can do, uh, build that out, make use of all of those benefits. And we just love to see the generosity of Christians encouraged and flourish and unleashed for the
Yeah.
sake of the kingdom.
Absolutely. Well, Lawrence, thank you so much for your time and thank you for coming on the podcast. And like I said
Brilliant.
before, if there's any questions that you've got for me or Lawrence, something that we can help kind of signpost you to a service or answer a quick question or just in some way be an encouragement and a blessing to you, then please get in contact at questions@thechurchoffice.co.uk. Please check out our resources online. Please check out Stewardship's resources. Have a look at their website. See if there's anything that might be useful and relevant to you. But it's been lovely to chat to you, Lawrence, and we'll see you again on the podcast. All right. Goodbye.
Thank you, Gavin. Yes, looking forward to that already.